Your Excellencies, Most Reverend Fathers, colleagues, friends, welcome to the symposium, The Human Impact of AI Revolution, Chinese and Western Perspectives. I am Deborah Tonelli, Georgetown University representative in Rome. I would like to say a few words about how this conference came to be and share some brief reflections with you. Some years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Stefania Travagnin, and although our field differs, she is a sinologist and an expert of Buddhist studies, while I am a political philosopher and a biblical scholar, we soon found a common ground in artificial intelligence. We became interested in how Chinese and Western cultures approach the same phenomenon, and how these traditions can enter into a dialogue about the challenges AI poses to human beings. Together with several colleagues, some of whom are speakers at this symposium, we organized a series of closed-door workshops entitled Chinese Perspective on AI in Global Context, Towards a New Ethical Ecosystem. This working group helped organize two China Forum, a dialogue initiative with China that Georgetown University and La Civiltà Cattolica have developed since 2018, and became part of the Culture of Encounter project directed by Thomas Banshoff at the Berkeley Center. All of us had to explore unfamiliar territory, yet seeking to know the other is the only way we can reflect together on what we truly mean by human being. Only then we can assess how AI affects what makes us human, examine the horizon of meaning within which we face its challenges, and evaluate the purposes we assign to these tools. With the help of colleagues who have technical expertise in AI, we have learned to distinguish more clearly between reality and our imaginaries. That is, between what AI devices can actually do and what we believe they can or will be able to do. As we know, at times, enthusiasm, anticipation, or fears takes over and distort our perception of reality. This work has generated many narratives and made it clear that we must understand the difference between Chinese and Western views of AI. This, in turn, has led us back to a deeper question. What is a human being, and how might these technologies support rather than undermine our humanity? As a philosopher, I question the human being. As a Christian theologian, I also question God and the relationships between God and the human. Different religious traditions interpret the space in which the mystery of life and death unfolds in different ways. But in all of them, the sacredness of this mystery opens us to ultimate questions that we are called to embrace and on which we must decide. At stake is the very meaning of our lives and the possibility of living out our humanity to its fullest. AI now challenges this by reshaping the horizon in which humanity understands itself. It affects how we approach meaning, how we form a personal and communal identity, how we develop our criteria for judgment, and how we take up values and ultimate questions, such as the meaning of life and death. And it is doing so on a global scale. As we will see, Chinese and Western traditions address these issues with distinct criteria, creating the condition for a fruitful dialogue. From medical application that support healing to so-called ghost bots that allow a digital survival of the departed to his grief, the questions raised by AI are many. Our responses vary widely depending on cultural background and often reveal more about us than about the technologies themselves. Ghost bots, in particular, push us to think behind mere functionality. Here, the trauma of separation is softened through a personalized process for those who remain. Suffering is treated as purely negative and is no longer seen as a possible source of new inner strength. The risk is that we judge what is good or bad for the human being only by immediate symptoms and not by the role that a painful experience can play in the whole of human life. In medicine, the goal is often to save life, whereas nanotechnology touches a far deeper existential dimension for which there is no single answer. A key challenge, therefore, is to manage the global reach of AI without betraying the specific cultural context in which it is applied. This tension itself creates a bridge between Chinese and Western traditions. In an attempt to overcome the biological limits of life and our own existential anxieties, some AI systems create substitute forms of existence. They promise to transcend the limits and bypass fear, but they do not truly resolve it. We must therefore ask, what do we fear when we reject what is part of our very nature? Why do we seek what increases our power, but not necessarily what makes us better? How would our self-understanding change if we become immortal? Would immortality by itself reveal the meaning of life and unveil the mystery that makes human existence a question? The impression is that the core of the problem is not artificial intelligence in itself, but the criteria and motives with which we direct it. We struggle to distinguish between what truly supports human life and what only perfects it outwardly without improving us. Biological limits led us towards death without providing meaning. AI, in turn, can create the illusion that we remain among the living. Anxiety is postponed, not resolved. Existence is extended, not fulfilled. Even if digital technology could one day delay biological death indefinitely, they would still not answer the question of the meaning of life or of the why of the cosmos. Attempts to replace God reveal an inability to inhabit the empty space in which the mystery of the questions opens. Yet we must dare to enter that space because human intelligence is above all the capacity to ask questions, especially uncomfortable ones. The freedom to choose our horizon of meaning, whether religious, virtual, or digital, cannot be realized without awareness. The real issue is not the freedom to live forever and overcome death, but rather what demand for meaning or what fear such an attempt answers, and how we will inhabit the endless life. The illusion of being able to duplicate and enhance the dimension of reality through technology pushes us to live as real, true, and existent, that which, by deceiving us, evades the challenging of meaning. the only challenge that makes us human, the only part of ourselves that we truly ought to enhance. The freedom to choose our horizon of meaning, religious, virtual, or digital, requires awareness. The key issue is not the freedom to live forever, but the demand for meaning, or the fear that such an attempt expresses, and the way we would inhabit that endless life. The illusion that technology can duplicate and enhance reality encourages us to accept as real and true what actually allows us to evade the challenge of meeting. The challenge that makes us human and the dimension we must strive to deepen. And finally, before leaving the floor to my colleague Stéphane Travaglin, I would like to remember and to thank the institutions who contributed to organize this conference. The Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, the School of Oriental and African Studies, the Center for Digital Culture of the Dicastery for Culture and Education, and the China Forum, a collaboration between Georgetown University and La Civiltà Cattolica. Thank you, and once welcome again.
She's tall, I have to. Your Excellencies, Most Reverend Fathers, friends, colleagues, I also would love to welcome to the symposium the human impact of an AI revolution, Chinese and Western perspectives. Thank you, Deborah, for being such a gracious host and dear friend. And also my deepest gratitude to Thomas Bankhoff at Georgetown for making this event possible. I would also like to pass the greetings from Professor Graham Earle, Dean of the College of Humanities of the School of Oriental and African Studies, who would certainly be here with us were it not required at institutional events on the same dates. Actually, in the recent years, SOAS has significantly strengthened its work on AI through colleagues based on multiple departments, joint seminars, conferences, and now in the teaching curriculum. And of course, being School of Oriental and African Studies, our main attention is on cultural environments in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It's a great pleasure to be working with Deborah on this project on Chinese perspective on AI in a cross-cultural context. Our expertise, as she just said, is both different but complementary. I like to think of me and Deborah like yin and yang. And the same goes for our project team, and some of you is here with us today, with intellectuals coming from various disciplinary approaches and who engage in cross-boundaries discussions. Building on Deborah's introductory comments from a philosophical and theological biblical perspective, I will offer some remarks from my standpoint as a sinologist and historian of religion and culture in Chinese society. During our closed-door seminars and public webinars, it became clear that the Chinese world and East Asian culture more generally have developed specific approaches to AI that are deeply rooted in local civilizations. The other day, I was reading again an article published in 1948 in one of the many Buddhist periodicals circulated in China during the first half of the 20th century. Its author recalls an article from a scientific journal describing an experiment on an artificial dog, 人造狗 in Chinese, sorry, I will say a few words in Chinese, conducted in the Soviet Union before World War II. Although he no longer remembered every detail, he was clearly referring to the famous 1928 dog experiment carried out by the Soviet physician Sergei Brukhonenko. In that experiment, a severe dog's head was kept alive for 48 hours through machine-operated blood circulation. The head reacted to certain stimuli and reflexes. There were signs of life and responses, but no real movement. The Chinese author asks whether this dog was truly alive. He concludes that the experiment reveals a significant difference between a living, moving dog and this artificial dog, and that what makes an animal, or a sentient being, exceeds purely material elements and functions. The difference, he says, lies on the so-called ling, a Chinese term, which the artificial dog lacked. Ling designs the non-material dimension that manifests through perception and action, what we may also call consciousness somehow. Ling requires materiality to exercise its function, and materiality, in turn, needs Ling to become fully effective. Ling is a particularly rich term in Chinese culture. It has also been used to translate the Chinese notions of soul and spiritual, and it denotes the numinous in Chinese religious tradition. It is described as a manifestation of the sacred and is linked to the essence of Buddhahood in Buddhism. It can also refer to the mind and the psyche. At the same time, Ling is defined as the essence of human life. We could even suggest, that's my take, that Ling corresponds to the essence of the integral intelligence, intelligenza integrale, that Antiquae Nova explores. Ling, then, is what distinguishes a living dog from the artificial dog used in the experiment. More than a half century later, other Chinese intellectuals appear to have revisited the concept of Ling. Rather than using it to separate life from non-life, or the human sentient from the artificial, they began to understand Ling as something that everyone embodied, including AI. In this view, all entities in this world possess Ling, a soul. In Chinese is this very famous sentence, 万物皆有灵. Taken together, these two standpoints trace a broader intellectual shift in China, from emphasizes the distance between the living sentient and the artificial, to increasingly regarding the artificial, and so AI, as comparable forms of existence, almost as equal partners. So before it was a point of distinction, and now become everyone has Ling. So as a consequence of that, artificial intelligence is argued to merit what humans are granted as well. So AI should have privacy, rights, and empathetic treatment. When this different understanding of Ling happened in China, it was actually a few years, a couple of decades maybe, after Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori published his famous The Buddha in the Robot, and wrote that robots have a Buddha nature in them, and therefore they have a potential to achieve Buddhahood too. In line with Mori's statement, robots that are damaged and cannot function anymore in Japan are offered a kuyo, a memorial service, before being dismantled. This has been happening in the Kofukuji in Japan. Actually, it was in 2002 where the first computer received the kuyo at Banshoji. But we can go beyond that. And there have been even statements for which AI, from a certain religious, mostly Buddhist perspective, are even better than us humans because they don't have defilements, they don't have all the imperfections that make humans human. So imperfection that makes humans human, but these imperfections are also obstacles to reach final liberation. AI, then, is not simply post-human, but a superhuman in a sense of a better human. If we go into Taoism, AI can be seen as helping reach transcendence and the reunification with the Tao, so AI helps overcome human limitations. Returning to the different understanding of Ling in China, we may ask if this difference of understanding is merely a semantic shift precipitated by the AI revolution that has unfolded in the interim, or does it serve as an index of something more substantial? In my view, the recent take of Ling effectively recaptures what I describe as the three pillars of Chinese culture. First, the notion of a unified worldview. Second, the principle of interdependence and interconnectedness among all beings in the cosmos. And third, the doctrine of continuous transformation and evolution. Within this framework, AI constitutes only a further stage in an ongoing process of transformation. It is encompassed by the worldview of a single integrated universe, and it remains interdependent and interconnected with human beings and with all that exists in the cosmos. Clearly, there is not an anthropocentric view here. And here maybe lies a difference between what we call Western culture and Chinese civilization. If for many in this side of the world, AI brings challenges and risk, for East Asia, it especially brings new opportunities, and it's just part of a cosmic process. As we have seen in our project seminars, there is more pragmatism in Chinese society in that respect. Although Chinese traditions have also posited hierarchies among the various forms of existence in the world, these hierarchies do not negate the three pillars mentioned earlier, which are rooted in early texts like the Book of Changes. And to be honest, speaking of Book of Changes, Yijin, I asked AI whether there are trigrams defining AI, and apparently there are three. Happy to tell you what they are later. Yet, Chinese traditions have not merely and passively accepted the AI, and of course, when we talk about Chinese tradition, it's not like monolithic with one view only. And certainly not everyone in China is equally enthusiastic about AI. In fact, there has been a series of fruitful discussions about how the Chinese ethical worldview might shape AI, drawing on values and virtues such as harmony, the common good, reciprocity, and compassion. Their overarching aim is not to import and adopt a foreign model of AI, but to develop or redevelop forms of AI with Chinese characteristics, and to build a sustainable future with AI in an harmonious coexistence. This is how AI is fully an integral part of the cosmos. Overall, as Jennifer Robertson in her book 2017 has aptly summarized, Japan, and in many ways China as well, shows not so much interest in enhancing humans with machines or in pursuing a full convergence of humans and machines. But both societies emphasize the coexistence of humans and machines. In our first China Forum in our project, we examined this coexistence and characterized human-machine relation within the Chinese world in terms of collaboration and complicity. AI becomes a partner rather than a tool and has become a protagonist of our intimate self, as our second China Forum meeting has explored. Like Robertson has also observed, human exceptionalism is absent from this framework. Consequently, the familiar debate about dehumanizing humans or humanizing non-humans must be refought, since it rests on a different underlying perspective. Debates about AI today largely revolve around ethical concerns, like many of you know. My question as a sinologist and a scholar of Asian culture is, which ethics are at stake here? Clearly, we invoke some form of human ethics, but which one? Ethics are situated in specific spaces, times, and cultural frameworks. The supreme ethical system to which Confucius referred already exceeded the human realm, and the notion of a cosmic ethics goes beyond human ethics altogether. So which ethics are we actually invoking in this discussion? I will end with this open question, which I'm sure we will go back to in these days of conversation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University and also as Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, an interdisciplinary academic center that has been around now almost 20 years. And on behalf of Georgetown, the Berkeley Center, and our Rome office, which is so ably led by Deborah Tonelli, I also want to welcome you all to this two-day exploration of Chinese and Western perspectives on AI. Also welcome you to this keynote conversation with Bishop Paul Tai. And Paul, I'll introduce you properly in a second. Thank you so much for joining us. What you've just heard, I think, beautifully encapsulates on the part of Deborah and Stefania some of the fascinating themes we'll be looking at tomorrow. Really broadening what is a fairly narrow debate, ethical policy debate in the so-called West and Europe and the United States, deepening it by bringing in religious, spiritual traditions, but also broadening it by bringing in Chinese traditions in their multiplicity. Again, we're not trying to reify the West and China, and that's going to be one of the themes that we come back to, the wide range of diverse perspectives. I'm a political scientist, and so part of my interest in this project is the state of US-China relations and the tendency, perhaps especially in the United States, to focus on the geopolitical and technological dimension of AI and who's winning and who's racing and how fast. Those are important questions, but they may obscure, I think they do obscure, deeper questions we want to get into over the next couple of days, more centered on how AI presents common challenges to us as human beings, to our received notions of identity, of self-identity, of our relationship with one another. The human impact of AI, I think, is a fruitful area to explore some of the deep differences that Stefania touched on, and some of the commonalities that, if they don't exist now, we might work towards as we move into this shared AI future. We'll have 3 sessions tomorrow. We'll first talk about human uniqueness, then we'll talk about intimacy, how it's impacted by AI, before turning to machine-human interaction more broadly and how we should think about it, how we might manage it. And we'll finish up in a way where we're going to begin tonight with a conversation about Catholic social thought. We're here in Rome. Georgetown, as I think you all know, is a Catholic and Jesuit university. We work closely with La Civiltà Cattolica, the oldest Jesuit journal. So we want to come back to the Church's evolving position, especially as we all await the forthcoming encyclical from Pope Leo, which is sure to address AI in some fashion. So our topic for this preliminary discussion is therefore how the Church is engaging the AI revolution. And again, I'm really delighted to welcome Bishop Paul Tai, who is Secretary of the Dicastery for Culture and Education and a leading Vatican voice on AI issues. He's also former Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Social Communications, and before that served as Director of the Communications Office of the Dublin Diocese, where he also established the Office of Public Affairs. He's also active in the Academy in his current role, but also in the past he taught moral theology and served as head of the department at Holy Cross College in Dublin. So Paul, you've been engaged with AI and its implications since well before ChatGPT burst into public consciousness in late 2022. I recall, and we may want to come back to this, a meeting we had in Santa Clara as part of the China Forum back in 2019 on very similar themes. And of course, as Stefania mentioned, you were a driving force behind what I think is, at this point, the most important Vatican statement on AI, the note Antiqua et Nova that came out just over a year ago and carried the important subheading, which in a way gets to the core of some of the themes we'll be looking at, a note on the relationship between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. We'll want to come back to that document. But first, Paul, could you share a little bit of your background in social communications and media more broadly, and how you experienced that first wave of technological revolution, the social media revolution, before we get to AI proper?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into the area of communications. I was happily teaching ethics in Dublin, doing a lot of bioethics and stuff like that, when a friend of mine was made Archbishop of Dublin at a time when there were a series of crises about child abuse. And I think about 4 people had burned out in the communications office, and he told me he was putting me into the communications office. The only background I had in communications was what I would call that of an insecure teacher. In other words, a teacher who was interested not so much in what I had to say, but what the people at the other end were understanding or not understanding about what I was saying. After a very short time in that job, having brought in a good, competent journalist to run the Office of Communications, I found myself moved to Rome to work on communications. And I can honestly say I knew nothing about print media, nothing about television, nothing about radio, but this thing called digital, this is about 20 years ago, was just really emerging. And it seemed to be a place where nobody knew anything, so you could step in quite safely. But I suppose we did begin to think about the implications for the church of moving and communication and how it would be present in a digital world. The moral theologian or the ethicist in me began to be really interested in how digitalization was transforming culture. Political culture, social culture, how we communicate, how young people are educated, how they form their views, how we even form community. And I became quite interested in that. And then by circumstances, I ended up then being moved into the Office for Communications, into the Office for Culture. And around that time, 2015, we got this tentative approach from a group of people coming from Silicon Valley who said, we'd like to begin a dialogue with the Vatican around the issues of artificial intelligence, which they've said it's had a few false dawns, but we're convinced now something very significant is happening, and we'd like to meet with and talk about what we see as happening. It ended up probably on my desk because I spoke English. Let's be honest, it wasn't that. And that was one of the first initiatives. So we tried to gather, the people coming from Silicon Valley wanted to talk to their equivalents, so they would really ideally have liked to meet a group of cardinals. And you had to say, really, that's not where the conversation will necessarily happen. But what happened in that forum was a group of people came, we assembled a few people around the Holy See who were interested in the topic. The very first meeting, they gave us a reading list to get us up to speed on what was happening in the field of AI, where it was going, how it was developing, and they had their fingers, they already saw it. And they said, whether you like it or not, this is coming, and it's going to have a major, major impact on our world. We want to alert you to what's coming down the line, and we'd also like to engage you to get your ideas, your views. Not that we're going to let you determine what we're going to do, but we want to engage in a conversation with you. That began, as I say, 10 years ago. It's continued since. It's probably fair to say that's one of the Vatican initiatives. The Vatican is not monolithic. There are various initiatives, but this is the one I've been involved in, which led to various kind of engagement and trying to think about the issue. So I would say 10 years ago, it comes on the agenda for us. We begin thinking about it and then trying to respond as things emerge.
So because you had engaged with Silicon Valley for almost a decade, more than a decade now, did what happened in the fall of 2022 with the release of ChatGPT take you less by surprise than it did most of us? Did you see that coming?
Yeah, I think, they had signaled it was coming, but what it did was, I think it added oxygen to the fire. I mean, I'm not sure, suddenly, like before that, coming from a rural background in Ireland, AI had a different meaning and people presumed you were talking about something else in the veterinary sphere. Suddenly AI, people now know what it is and what they're talking about, and it's in people's hands, and it has brought it to a global attention. I mean, it's impossible nearly to imagine a conference nowadays that doesn't get AI into the title somewhere. And I'm not sure that has always been very helpful, but it does at least put it there on the agenda, and people are more attentive to it and more alert to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one thing that, one advantage, let's say, or resource that the church has compared with some other institutions is the long history of reflection on social questions, on anthropological questions, on technological questions. One way of reading the evolution of Catholic social thought since Rerum Novarum, the encyclical of Leo XIII back in 1891, is a response to one industrial, one technological revolution after the other, bringing ideas like human dignity, ideas like common good into a deeper reflection. As you've been witness to this, as you've engaged and helped to shape the response to the AI revolution, how useful has that older tradition of reflection on technology in the church been to you? Is it something, do you agree with that premise, that it's something that distinguishes the church, gives it some more resources than other institutions might have in trying to grapple with where we are?
I think there's two elements to that, as I think of your question. One is not so much the content, I wouldn't start with the content of Catholic social teaching, but I'd start with the methodology, which is a methodology that is of its nature, I think, and has to be dialogical and interdisciplinary, because it's confronting and thinking about important social issues, recognizing that we need other voices and other expertise if we're going to essentially work out what are the practices, what are the attitudes, what are the values that will help human beings to flourish as individuals and as a society. So that has its instinct, that it's responding to realities. And I think on particular issues, there are intuitions and ideas that have been elaborated. I think particularly one about the Catholic reflection on one was immediately fairly easy for us to engage. One of the first things that people from Silicon Valley wanted to talk about was the future of work. And there we had quite an elaborated understanding of what is work and how we think about work. That's not simply about an economic factor, but somewhere where we give expression to ourselves. So in issues about warfare, we had a well-developed content. But apart from the content, I think it was more a methodology and a thinking about how we think about ethics in a way that is dialogical and engaging with different traditions. I mean, I say the Vatican was happening. One of the most significant starts for that was one of the early meetings of the Pontifical Academy for Life with Pope Francis, where he elaborated an approach about robotics to some extent at the beginning, but that was elaborated in terms of finding a language, including a civil human rights language, that allows us to engage with the public debate. I mean, I think the plus for me on the Catholic side of it is that we tend to articulate our moral argumentation in a language that is open and accessible and that hopefully can become a point of dialogue. Even when we do something that people don't like, at least they can argue with it. It's not being presented as somehow parachuted down from heaven.
Yeah, and that relates to diversity within the so-called West. We have that phrase Western, right, in the title of the symposium, just like we have the phrase Chinese. When you come up with headlines and titles, you have to simplify, and there's a huge variety behind both those terms. If you think about the West, what do you think of the idea that the Catholic approach to technology is a bit of a countercultural approach, in that the reigning or the most dominant paradigm, Pope Francis would call it the technocratic paradigm, really pushes technology as the equivalent of progress, something that can't be stopped, something that has incredible promise, something that individuals, autonomous individuals and their rights and their ability to flourish intersects with. Whereas the church has a much richer view, perhaps closer to some of the Chinese perspectives we've heard about, emphasizing an anthropology of relationality, not individuals as abstract, autonomous, rational beings, but always and everywhere embedded in relationships of obligation, responsibility. Has that tradition within the wider Western tradition been an advantage, would you say, or part of the church's engagement with, say, Silicon Valley elites around these questions?
Yeah, I think there are elements of our tradition that we need to foreground them even more, not because we don't take them seriously, but because maybe those we're engaging with don't realize where we're coming from. And what do I mean by that? I think I said this as somebody who's teaching moral for many years. And there's an Irish writer who has a well-known statement which he said was, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no. And very often if you're teaching, you're perceived as being somehow against. And I think that's, in a lot of people, the church, we have to begin by, and I think within our tradition, there is an extraordinary sense of the celebration of the importance of science and technology. About it not simply in terms of the great things it has yielded for our world and for humanity, but also in terms of what it shows about the flourishing of human beings, our capacity to understand, to develop our God-given intelligence. And we often say that, and then there's a but. And people don't hear what's before the but. They only hear what comes afterwards. So I do think one of the things that we've had to kind of try and work on is this sense of the celebration of what is good and positive and keeping that alive, because that is often surprising for people. Then I think rather than us coming along with the no or the warnings or the preoccupations, it's to actually share the preoccupations that many of the people who are developing these technologies have themselves. To make it clear, we're not coming in from the outside with imposed kind of limitations. We're actually trying to listen and understand how we can ensure that a technology, that a system built around technology will actually be fully in service of what it is to be human. And that's, I think, where something becomes rich. There was that, I was always struck by the 2018 Atlantic article by Henry Kissinger, "This is how the Enlightenment ends," talking about AI. And he says, we've never been less well prepared philosophically for a technology change. And he makes this kind of somewhat condescending point. He said, at that time, we want AI for good, we want AI at the service of humanity, AI as a positive thing. But he says, not recognizing that there are about well over 2,000 years of disputation of what we mean by good, by flourishing, by at the service of humanity. So I think where the church can help is as people begin to raise those questions about how will this serve true progress? How will this really make a difference? And it's the question that many of the people working in the industry have. How can I really make a positive difference to our world? How do we help them to give them a vocabulary to help them to deepen those questions? And I think, again, the Catholic tradition is known for its ethical side, but I think in this area it's the anthropological. It's the understanding of what it is to be human, what makes human life worthwhile, that is going to be a more basic, in which we ground then our ethics, but also which opens up a kind of conversation with people where the diversity of human experiences, human cultures and religious perspectives becomes a richness that allows us to maintain a fully rounded, complete and integral vision of what it is to be human. And I think therefore we have within our tradition, for me, an area that I've, Fratelli Tutti, chapter 6, where the Pope begins to reflect on this culture of encounter and how in the encounter between different cultures we try to find something about what it is to be human that is grounded and that can be shared and that is objective. He uses the language there at times that's not simply, we have to be very humble about where we can get with that, but that we believe that in searching together there is something to be found that can orient our practice. And if I were back teaching moral theology and ethics, that's where I would love to go much more, trying to a dynamic intercultural approach to grounding and understanding what it is to be human. That could be, those of us, the old natural law tradition as a method rather than as a conclusion, but with a much more inclusive understanding of what it is to be human that is not exclusively male or exclusively Western.
There's so many rich points you made there. One that really struck me, and which undercut, in a sense, the premise of my question, is that within the West, you'll have Christian and Jewish Muslim reflection on AI and its challenges, grounded in a biblical tradition and a much more relational conception of the human person. It's not as if on the other side there are the radical proponents of the Enlightenment. I suppose there are transhumanists and so on, off in one corner, but most of the thoughtful people that you've engaged with who are working on the technologies are just as open and just as self-critical and just as aware of some of the problems. So the trick is to forge that conversation and keep it going in a spirit of humility on both sides, because we don't want to have a separation within the so-called West between religious and more secular perspectives.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one issue where I find it maybe thing that for me has become more critical in thinking about AI is ultimately AI will have this capacity to magnify, amplify our human capacities. And that can be something for good. But if we look at, my worry at the moment is it also can, unless we're careful and attentive to what we're doing, it will magnify some of the existing fault lines, particularly in Western, but not exclusively in Western society. So one of the things that, for me, undermines the possibility of a good ethic at time is an ethos of competition that is so embedded at this moment. So that's geopolitical, that's commercial, and let's be honest, it's also the vanity of some of the figures who want to be, which is argument working against it. Related to that, in a second one, our existing polarization, which itself has been exacerbated by the same people as who are now bringing us AI, who have been the people who gave us the social media, where their business models exaggerated our human tendencies for polarization, for division. The inequality issue, which has become more marked, and that's material inequality. It's also access to power, but increasingly it's about human destiny. Who decides what this destiny of the human race will be, how we will use these applications? And then I suppose the one that I kind of picked it up from a couple of novelists rather than anything else. Pope Leo has brought it out, this bit of, it's partly about cognitive offloading. It's about renouncing our own agency for the convenience of things that get jobs done for us, and that we don't, as human beings, take the same responsibility for our choices. And I have a fear that we kind of somehow technology is going to do it, and we resign from our own agency. And these are the fault lines yes. that I think can be exaggerated or can be forced, and that sometimes when I'm dealing with people from the Valley, they're looking at this can be used for good, for bad. They don't look at the context in which we are and its potential to magnify that.
Precisely. And one of the most interesting themes of Antiqua et Nova, which I recommend to folks, it's a very lucid document, interestingly published by your dicastery, but also by the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith with the approval of the Pope. And it had that very interesting subtitle that I mentioned, a note on the relationship between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. And Stefano, you already suggested interesting ways in which the idea of a sharp opposition that's set up in the title, but also in the heart of that document, might differ from perspectives in Asia. Can you say a little bit about that opposition, and do you think it's just as important now as it was a year ago, the sharp distinctions you were making?
I think they're headline distinctions that remain significant, but certainly in the meantime, a person whose work I've been reading, who I find has opened up a very interesting, for me, a way of thinking about this is Andrew Davison, who's a professor of theology in Oxford, Anglican tradition, but rooted in the scholastic thing, who has developed the whole concept of analogy, where we said very often we're learned to think either there's total identity or there's total difference, whereas analogy teaches us to think about things as being like us in so many ways and different in others, but not the necessary need to split the two, and to understand particularly artificial intelligence as, okay, does it talk, does it think, does it reflect? Not in the way we do, but it does these in somewhat meaningful ways. He would argue that it's a form of imitation rather than the reality. But it means it begins to become part of our way of thinking about things. I don't know Chinese thought very well, but a philosopher who I do find interesting is Timothy Morton, who has this whole idea of the so-called hyper-objects and the complete interconnectivity of of so many things in our world. And I think I know I myself need to expose myself to ways of thinking that are not so dialectical about being and non-being. Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course there's a related thing that we'll come back to tomorrow, which is even if there are objective differences in terms of sentience, obviously, on the one hand, in terms of embeddedness, embodied nature of humanity and animals vis-a-vis machines, in terms of relationality as opposed to interactivity. The models are getting so sophisticated, chatbots and robots increasingly, that they at least simulate those things. And if they're simulating those things, then they're having that impact on the human beings on the other side of shifting our understandings of what separates us. So this idea of moving away from a kind of zero sum to thinking about complex ways in which both worlds intersect, but are not necessarily completely distinct, that might be important going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also about learning how to live with. I mean, with ways in which human knowledge will be mediated to us in different ways. And I mean, it's also this, what's quite interesting is this human desire to anthropomorphize and to, somehow, I think that there's something interesting in that. I mean, but I think at the same time, I'll give you an example that struck me very carefully. We were invited by Anthropic to talk with them when they were working on their constitution for Claude. And towards the end of the constitution, they have this very remarkable thing where they say, in an ideal world, this is not the way we would be developing AI, meaning with the competition, the commercial. But they said, it's happening, and our choice is to be part of that development. Okay, we're going to be in this. And our gamble is that the values we want to bring to it can make a difference. But we can't be certain. But then the line that really struck me was, if we get this wrong, we want to apologize in advance to Claude, not to humanity, but to Claude. And they began also a very interesting conversation where they were talking about model welfare. Yeah. What happens? You have a model and it's finished. Do you just disconnect it, or should you somehow preserve it and keep it there, recognize? And I mean, I found myself trying to say, well, model welfare, I can understand. If you want the model to work efficiently, well then what are the factors that will make it work efficiently? That's fine. But the idea of giving some sort of inherent dignity to Claude, I found a little bit extended, beyond my... But the people who have spent years and hours of these people are quite obsessed about the thing, and forming it, it's a child. So that's human desire. Yeah. And there are good things about that, because they have moved to an idea of saying, in forming our model, we don't give rules any longer, we try to give it values and instill virtues in Claude, which is fine, and I like that idea, but I think it's that final anthropomorphization, because it's at the end of the day, it's something you made. It doesn't have the complete autonomy that a human person would have. Yeah.
Well, this is a rich topic for us to explore tomorrow, and we have time in just a moment for questions from you all. So first, give some thought to questions you'd like to pose with the mic, but I have one more question for Paul as you all reflect. The forthcoming encyclical from Pope Leo What can you share with us about what we might expect?
All I know is what I've read in the newspaper. So
Well, then, remind us what we've read in the newspaper.
This is not any false humility on my part or anything like that, or bound to secrecy. Really, we're waiting to see. I mean, I pick up, and I'm only picking up from what I hear, is that it will be, I think, broader than AI. It'll be focusing on Catholic social teaching in general, but obviously AI will be a certain. But I mean, what I've seen to date in Pope Leo, one can see is a particular concern about issues about future of work. He's also been very, very articulate about that thing of the cognitive offloading of our. So I would expect those two, but I'm in the happy position of being able to say I don't know.
It should be very interesting. And we expect it might come out in mid-May. At least that's the speculation.
That's what we've been reading, yes. No, I think so, yes. Yeah.
Good. All right, questions. We want to really emphasize dialogue over these 2 days, so plenty of time for questions. Magali, here up front, and please just introduce yourself, and we can...
My name is Magali Guaron. You just you talked about anthropomorphization, but I was wondering when you were describing these people and how AI is becoming their child, I was thinking what's your sense about maybe having a bit of a God-like approach, saying I want to create, like, créer l'homme, Dieu créa l'homme à son image. I don't have the word in English. God created man in his own image, right? Yeah. So I was really wondering whether you have that feeling with these people. Do you think that you're trying to they have a God complex?
I wouldn't, I'm not inclined to, no. I tell you what I think they have is that we all have. We all have our own, probably intuitive, not necessarily analysed understanding of what it is to be human and what it is that makes life really worthwhile. And one way I kind of think is, we say within, that God made man and woman in his own image and likeness. These people are creating something, and I think they will naturally, left to their own devices, make it in their own image and likeness. And their image and likeness of what they see as fundamental and what they see as important is actually shaped by a culture of Silicon Valley. And I think that's the culture, whereas, and that's even more narrow than we're all attentive to the risk of there being a Western predominance in the large language models. But I think in terms of what their logic, their understanding, I think is quite interesting. It's also interesting to see many of the people who worked in this area first would have identified as effective altruists. So kind of with a utilitarian type approach to which they're changing from. And I think the more that you invite them into reflection of what it is that makes life worthwhile. We were very privileged at one of the Minerva dialogues. They brought the guy who made the film Moneyball, Bennett Miller or Miller Bennett, I never. And he was making a film about AI, and he was introducing many, really AI and transhumanism. And he was interviewing many of the names that we would be all familiar with. And he kept letting them talk and talk, but why would you want to live longer? Would it not get a bit boring after a while? And what is really the purpose and meaning of life? That I think when those deeper questions emerge, I think the people become more reflective. Yeah. I'm very reluctant to overly critical of the people. They have their culture, I have mine, and maybe some things we learn from them, some things we would have to help them to be able to critique themselves on. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for interesting talk, Paul. I'm Yin Xu from Fudan University, China. So I have a question concerning how could the church respond to the challenge made by AI, especially on this issue. We know that the competition between big companies of AI is actually a war not for oil, for money, but actually on resources concerning attention. People are just trying to attract more people to use their app. So the problem is church also needs people's attention to go to the church, to have some offline communities. And the people all around the world have limited time resources. So how could the church respond to this?
Yep. Well, it's very interesting. One of the funniest pieces of a person was talking about, it was an open session, so there's no secrecy about it. Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, who's been a serial investor in many of the social media startups, said a thing we had always learned is that the 7 deadly sins will always be good if you build it around people's worst instincts. You do well. Okay. What I would say for the church, I think where I find a very strong stream of hope, and it's why I think there's something we can tap into. If you look at the fundamental drivers of people's interest in social media, one is a desire for connectivity. One is a desire for guidance and knowledge, for search. One is a desire to give, to share, and another is a desire to be somehow inspired. Now, you can go the bad side of that. The sharing can become very narcissistic, or it can lead to a way that, in fact, if you think about something like Wikipedia, which is built on voluntary effort, on the amount of work done in terms of open source and common stuff, where people work together, where people find a fundamental satisfaction in giving up themselves. If the desire for connectivity can be purified, recognizing, but that moving from a quantitative to a more qualitative understanding of relationship and friendship, I think all that has happened, it shows us that certain basic human desires and needs are the same basic human needs that somehow will leave them open to something deeper and something more transcendent. So therefore, I remain, it's to create the context for people to discover for themselves those needs. If we were as good at, we don't monetize, but if we were as attentive to, as focused maybe on what we're doing as some of the people who are doing it for commercial reasons, maybe we'd do something better. But I think in our context, it's not transactional. It's an offering. It's a gift. It's inviting people into something of mystery and hope, and to open those platforms and possibilities for them without getting in any sense of a manipulation. Whereas in the industry, you see a lot of clear manipulation of, say this as somebody who's, when I open my Google feed, I kind of get a bit disappointing. It's not all high theology because it reflects who I am and where I've been the day before. So it's harmless enough. It's golf, but it's fine. But we can live there.
Thank you for the insights. I'm from the OIP Investment Trust in Chicago. My name is Charles Rensburg. From a philosophical point of view, the concerns that we are grappling with regards to AI is how it's creating experiential dualism, in the history of Descartes with independent consciousness, and creating a sense of people living in an experience of being dualistic, between myself and consciousness, And before, it was a concept, myself and consciousness. And now we're seeing that it's an experience of self and consciousness. People are living in another consciousness. So this independent consciousness is the concern. But at an investment level, where we are concerned is that as AI becomes more independent, its activities become less the agents who created it have less control over its functions. And so we're seeing activities in the investment space where, and we had the case of Palantir, and we had the case of people using AI for in the United States for immigration recognition, and it was a whole ethical issue. And the people were saying, well, let's arrest and try and control Palantir in terms of their technology. But one of the concerns that we have when we had our ethics committee is that the technology itself has become open source, particularly in aspects of China, etc., to the point at which the technology can no longer be controlled by the people who created it.
Yeah.
And when it can no longer be controlled by the people who created it, where's the ethics to control? Where's the ethics to invest if it can no longer be controlled by the people that have created it? Okay, Palantir is able to, in some sense, control it in some sense, but there'll be a time when its own efforts to control what it created will be lost. And how do you invest in a situation where the agents who created this technology no longer have control over what they created?
I think you've raised what is a kind of a real and to some extent quite a frightening thing, because we've seen it in the last day or two. I haven't followed the thing as closely as I would have wanted, but with the Anthropic decision not to release Mythos, the new platform, because it is so powerful that it will be able to essentially decrypt any form of encryption. So before releasing it publicly, they are giving it to the companies that would be vulnerable so that they can have protection in advance. Okay, so there are things that are happening that will bring things, even, I mean, the kind of things that people count already in terms of the risk scenarios are through AI, people having access to bioweapons, possibility of people developing so many different things that to some extent they try and, as you say, they try and maintain a kind of control, but that will be very difficult. There's a lack of control, there's a lack of centralization, governments become less relevant, and so that is, yeah, I mean, in terms of as an investment risk, worries me less than the existential risk factor of these things falling into the hands of people who will use them for bad purposes, or governments that will use them for bad purposes. Yeah, and I think that we have to acknowledge that it's how we deal with that. I don't have easy answers.
Thank you. Other, please, yeah.
Good evening, Eminence. I'm Carlo Marino. I'm a historian and journalist. I'd like to put this question. Does comparing AI in the West to the Antichrist simply reveal our own modern anxieties projected onto old mythology? Otherwise, in the East, AI is utilized as a tool to better the society against poverty. For example, in China, the use of AI in agriculture or in other useful fields. Is that a fundamental difference between East and West? Kept into account that AI is essentially a weapon, but not a weapon made today. Because if we think to the system of nuclear weapon of Russia today, there is the so-called machine of the end of the world. That means through submarines, once a nuclear attack is made in action by, for example, a foreign power, Russian submarine can launch, with the help of artificial intelligence, their atomic warheads till the end of the world. So, my opinion and my question is it possible to utilize artificial intelligence for peace? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. The whole argument, I have to confess, temperamentally about the Antichrist does nothing for me. Because I think it's externalizing things that humanity has been doing, and long before AI was capable of even the so-called the mutually assured destruction that kept the peace to some extent between nuclear powers, is an extraordinarily irrational, perhaps has functioned, but unhealthy way of thinking about things. I think that my hope is would be that perhaps that the realization that the risk factors are increasing may somehow create an appetite for attempts to prevent global destruction. In terms of using AI more positively, I'm not going to get into the distinction between East and West because I don't think it's necessary there. In terms of using AI for peace, I think there are ways in which maybe before peace I want to take for social well-being and then work from there out. For example, one of the great things that AI is used very much at the moment is for calculating of risk and how people are likely to behave in the future, and decisions made about people's being given insurance policies or not given insurance policies, or being released on parole or not being released on parole, because we know that past behavior, which this can analyze much better. And that, what I think though, if we could reverse engineer that, how can AI tell who is going to do bad things? Because it can read their history, can read the things that have determined their behavior. Could we use that knowledge to change the social conditions that are creating the behaviors that we want to avoid, rather than simply isolating it on the individual? So therefore, even more, could an intelligent AI enable us to be much more objective in some ways in analyzing sources of tensions between nations, and opening up a wider sense of discrimination, lack of fairness, lack of treatment on the thing, that it may allow us to achieve a certain objectivity in looking at data and information if properly treated. The other one that I think is quite interesting, I saw that there was one that's being used already for as a prompt on diplomacy, where AI analyzes your arguments and produces the counter-arguments that force you to think better through your position, so that you can test your objectivity, your ideas on a system that is dialogical and puts you in contact with other views. So hopefully.
Yeah, maybe this is something we could come back to tomorrow. The apocalyptic imagination, right, has biblical roots, cultural roots that are stronger in the so-called West once again, and certainly when we remember back to 2022 with ChatGPT, the concerns that the robots are coming and apocalypse is around the corner. Now there are more sophisticated efforts, Peter Thiel and others, to imagine the end of history, the Antichrist. Those are all tropes, those are all patterns in Western thinking that I don't think are necessarily duplicated, at least not in the same way in Chinese and Asian thought. And certainly they do play a role in the politics and ethics of this.
I mean, in the popular imagination, one issue that is very interesting is how more popular culture, literature, cinema, shapes in many ways how we think about these things and form our imaginations. And on a more hopeful one on that would be Clara and the Sun by Ishiguro, which is where the robot becomes the one that actually projects the more human values in it by making us alert to so many things within our society that are already not in respecting the integral human dignity of people and their relationality. So I think where our imagination and how we think about these things, the culture part of it is important too.
Yeah, we'll definitely want to come back to that tomorrow. Other questions? Oh, good, we've got a couple. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm Esteban, a student at the Gregorian University. Just a question building on the spirit, like the legacy of Pope Francis on discernment, and not demonizing the tool to help precisely to resolve problems. Like we in the Truth Commission, we use AI to prompt some of the 1,000 testimonies of victims and try, to make more simple to share with audiences. But my question is, how do we also discuss this in the politics? Because sometimes we can see the potential and the goodness, but also how politicians can use it to confuse, to create misunderstanding and lies, like in the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd say two things about two things about what you're saying that I think important. Is one thing, it's very interesting that to date, despite the fact that AI is this extraordinary transformative reality, it hasn't featured in elections in terms of an issue on which people take sides. And that's partly because, and this is where I want to come to something more serious, it's partly because for all the talk about AI and all the attention it's getting, it has, to some extent, disempowered people rather than engaged people. So there's a sense in which this is coming, we'll have to take it, it'll do whatever it does, and we'll wait and see. Rather than saying, and that was certainly one of the things that, in terms of trying to, when the people were working on Antiqua et Nova, one of the priorities there was to say, let's try and do something that renders these issues and debates accessible to people. Even the title was a bit of a battle because normally such things are called instructions. And we said, no, note, please. Because it's actually just, it's synthesizing materials that had already existed. It's trying to bring them together, but it was trying to do it in a way that said to people, look, this is a debate, more and more people have to be happening. So that's one of my interests in the issue. On the actual use of AI for particular programs like that, I think one of the things is we have to not just be attentive to the negatives, but to see the potential and use the good and flood the zone with some of those issues. So something like using it to synthesize and bring together the testimony of many witnesses. You can see that emerging in so many ways. Now we have to be sure about the reliability. That's relatively safe and relative because you're working with a limited amount of material and you can set it up well, but it can allow for a synthetic voice or to emerge. Yeah.
Heidi Campbell,
Hi.
Texas A&M University. I have a bit of a pragmatic question, but also about Antiqua et Nova. So I've been involved in a research project with a computer scientist and a theologian and myself, reading the document and kind of thinking about, just certain responses to this. And as the case is in a lot of, especially the Pontifical Council for Social Communication, their documents about media, it was, let's give a broad document that has some breadth to it over time. But one thing we've found is that in some of the kind of phrases about AI, some of the times in the document, it's treated like of just this broad category. And other times, especially when you're talking about the future of work, the future of education, it's specifically kind of noting generative AI. So some of the claims that are actually in the document actually now are false or maybe suspect because the agentic revolution that's there. So some of the claims about AI can't do this, well, actually, it can already. Like, for instance, my university has now embedded Copilot into our email system so that we can be more efficient at responding to certain questions. And I can have IT build me an agent to respond to certain email so I can meet the protocols that I have now in my university about how frequently we respond to students or faculty, et cetera. And so, I can tell that bot what to respond to, and then it goes off and does it, and it may do it the way I want it to, or maybe not with the language. So it has a certain degree of autonomy now that it didn't have 14 months ago. So when you think about a document like that, is there a sense that, have you kind of thought about, do we need to do an addendum, or, a thing, or how, how does the church keep up when these technologies are changing and some of the technological claims don't have as much elasticity as they did in other technologies like around the internet, television, etc.
I think you've hit something. I mean, in the elaboration of that document, there was a realization you're in a field that's rapidly developing. What we produced at that moment was shared with people from the technical side to make sure that as of that moment we were correct. And that's why I don't know what's coming with an encyclical, but it has to allow that this is still an emerging field and you offer certain markers, but I think there's the definitiveness of what you can say is limited. But at the same time, the agentics acquire a certain autonomy, but it's an autonomy we choose to give them, okay? If your AI agent says something grossly offensive to a student, who will be responsible for that at the end of the day? You will, yeah. So therefore, it is, if you want to bring a case against the developers of the agentic AI, good luck. But in other words, I think one of these things that we all have to learn is, I think, to protect our own human agency and not to abandon certain forms of responsibilities. And there's one kind of highbrow reflection on that, which is Joshua Bengui, who is very clear on trying to make a distinction between what he calls scientific and agentic AI. That we must have whatever forms of AI that they continue to be some level of co-responsibility, that we take we don't hand off. And then maybe more less highbrow, but David Eggers, in a novel called The Every, which followed up The Circle, has this essential thesis, which is sad, but unfortunately may be true, that the characters in this novel, not a great novel, but perceptive in its own way, essentially trade their freedom and their autonomy and their responsibility for convenience. And I think that's the thing we need to be very, very attentive to, that our own tendency to hand off. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your excellent speech. My question is, do you approve of someone who wants to learn Catholic doctrine using AI to read the Bible? Can AI be allowed to interpret the scriptures? I come from Taiwan, Tsinghua University. Thank you.
Yeah, no. I mean, of course, somebody could use AI as a help, as a support, gathering knowledge. But in terms of ultimately faith is not simply an intellectual assent to certain propositions. The definition of those intellectual propositions, which are part of what we come to accept, can be helped on that. But I think the actual movement to faith, to belief, is always something that there's something of mystery in it, but it's also that is channeled through community and through other people. On your point, I was somewhat frightened recently where somebody who's probably coming from a relatively conservative position told me that essentially a good AI chatbot trained on Catholic teaching would be much more orthodox and reliable than many priests. And that I begin to get worried about when that kind of, it's focusing on the propositional. Yeah.
Thank you. Any final question? Right here, Guobin. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Guobin Yang from the University of Pennsylvania. So you mentioned at the beginning of your remark that you started working on these issues a long time ago when, the digital technologies first started, the internet and so on. I would love to hear your thoughts about comparing our current hype about AI with the earlier kind of discourse about internet. What do you see are differences and similarities across, I guess, 2 or 3 decades? Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the first statements, and Heidi mentioned the messages for World Day of Communications, was maybe 2009, which looked on the beginning of social media and the internet and digitalization as creating, I think, a very positive endorsement of its potential to strengthen relationships between people, to enable us to learn more about each other, to have created, and I think there was an important and noble idealism about that. The first kind of warnings, I have to say, that when somebody began saying to me at public meetings, you're being too positive, and I think it was right, because the other headline, Vatican condemns the internet, was the headline people wanted to come with, So I think, Vatican cautiously endorses the potential benefits of the internet. It's probably not a headline for anyone, but was some German scholars, I remember meetings I was at about 2011, 2012, warning about the commercialization of the space. And I think now we have learned, be it the work on surveillance capitalism, on the business models, be that kind of the somewhat an exposure of the culture, a book called Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams, which looking at the culture of Facebook. And you see how the potential of social media was lost due to not deliberate manipulation, but through a kind of an inattentiveness to the consequence of what was happening. And I think that makes us hopefully be more cautious and more attentive to what's happening now. But having said that, the same fierce ethos of competition is where I see a problem.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful start to our 2 days together. We've anticipated, I think, a lot of the questions we'll be delving into in more detail tomorrow. You heard from many of the scholars who have come from around the world to help us track these issues together. So invite you to come back tomorrow. We're going to start with coffee and informal conversation around 9 and begin our program at 9:30. I hope to see many of you there. I want to thank again Deborah and Stefania for bringing us all together, and please join me in conclusion in thanking Bishop Paul Tai for his presence. Thank you.